On November 17, 1911, in the industrial town of Millbridge, Pennsylvania, a shocking discovery behind the walls of St. Catherine's Medical Institute would expose the systematic disappearance of 37 patients over the course of 18 years. The revelation came not through investigation or suspicion, but through a simple mistake. A wrong door opened during a routine inspection by the State Medical Board. What Inspector Harold Whitman found in that moment would haunt him for the remaining 14 years of his life. Behind what appeared to be a storage closet door lay a narrow corridor, one that shouldn't have existed according to the building's official blueprints filed with the city in 1893. The corridor led to 3 underground chambers, each more horrifying than the last. In the first, 22 glass containers held preserved human organs, meticulously labeled with patient names and dates ranging from 1893 to 1911. The second chamber contained surgical equipment that had no place in legitimate medical practice. Devices of restraint, extraction, and experimentation that belonged more to medieval torture than modern medicine. But it was the third chamber that broke Inspector Whitman's sanity. 7 living patients, ages ranging from 19 to 63, in various states of surgical modification, kept alive through methods that defied both medical understanding and human decency. The records of this discovery were sealed by federal order for 97 years, only released to the National Archives in 2000, and 8 under the Historical Transparency Act. Even then, 16 pages remain classified, their contents deemed persistently harmful to public welfare. The man responsible, Dr. Thomas Ellsworth Greaves, had been the town's most respected physician, a Harvard-educated surgeon who had delivered half the children in Millbridge and had served as the personal physician to 3 mayors and countless industrial magnates. But here's what makes this case particularly disturbing, what separates it from other medical horrors of the early 20th century. Dr. Greaves wasn't working alone. The investigation would reveal a network of collaborators spanning 4 states, including 2 senators, a federal judge, and at least 11 other medical professionals. They called themselves the Society for Human Advancement, and their stated goal, found in documents hidden in Greaves' personal library, was nothing less than the perfection of the human form through selective modification and controlled evolution. How does a respected doctor operate such a horror for nearly 2 decades without detection? How many more victims were never found? And perhaps most chilling of all, why did Dr. Greaves leave detailed instructions for continuing his work, instructions that investigators found had been recently accessed? Before we continue with Dr. Greaves and the horrors that lay beneath St. Catherine's Medical Institute, if this story intrigues you, if you're one of those brave souls who seeks the truth no matter how dark it might be, then please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. We uncover the stories that history tried to bury, the cases that were deemed too disturbing for their time, and we do it together as a community of truth seekers. I want to know, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. I'm particularly curious if anyone is from Pennsylvania, especially the Pittsburgh area where Millbridge once stood. You see, Millbridge doesn't exist anymore. It was absorbed into Pittsburgh's industrial district in 1943, but some of the old buildings remain. St. Catherine's Medical Institute is now a parking garage, but locals say that on November nights, you can still hear things from below ground level. Only the bravest viewers, only true mystery seekers, will want to continue from here. Because what we're about to uncover about Dr. Thomas Greaves and his 18-year reign of medical horror will challenge everything you thought you knew about the trusted figures in our communities. To understand how Dr. Thomas Ellsworth Greaves operated undetected for 18 years, you must first understand Millbridge, Pennsylvania in the 1890s. Picture a town of 47,000 souls, nestled in the Allegheny River Valley, where the air hung thick with coal smoke, and the rhythmic pounding of steel mills marked time better than any clock. This was America's industrial heartland at its peak, where fortunes were made in steel and coal, where immigrant families crowded into tenements hoping for their piece of the American dream, and where the gap between rich and poor was as vast as the furnaces were hot. Millbridge had grown from a village of 3,000 in 1870 to a thriving industrial center by 1893, the year Dr. Greaves arrived. The town boasted 17 mills, 4 coal mines within a 10-mile radius, and a population that swelled daily with Eastern European immigrants, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, and Italians, who came seeking work in the mills. These newcomers spoke little English, trusted few authorities, and when family members disappeared, they often assumed they had moved on to other cities for work or had succumbed to the countless industrial accidents that claimed an average of 43 lives per year in Millbridge alone. The town's elite lived on Prospect Hill, in mansions that overlooked the smoke-shrouded valley below. These were the mill owners, the bankers, the judges, men who had built their fortunes on steel and steam. They required discreet, sophisticated medical care, the kind that wouldn't gossip about their syphilis treatments or their wives' nervous conditions, that required extended stays at private facilities. They needed a doctor who understood that privacy was worth more than gold, and in Dr. Thomas Ellsworth Greaves, they found exactly that. Greaves had arrived in Millbridge with impeccable credentials. Harvard Medical School, class of 1889. 2 years of surgical residency at Massachusetts General Hospital. Published papers in the American Journal of Surgery on advanced techniques in abdominal reconstruction and the future of antiseptic procedures. At 31 years old, he was young enough to embrace modern medical techniques, but old enough to inspire confidence. He was tall 6 feet 2 inches, with prematurely gray hair that gave him a distinguished appearance. He spoke 4 languages fluently: English, German, French, and Italian, the latter being particularly useful in communicating with the immigrant population. Within 6 months of his arrival, Greaves had established St. Catherine's Medical Institute on Water Street, strategically located between the wealthy district of Prospect Hill and the immigrant neighborhoods of Coaltown and Little Warsaw. The building itself was a marvel, a 4-story brick structure with modern electric lighting, one of only 3 buildings in Millbridge to have a telephone connection, and the first medical facility in western Pennsylvania to have a Röntgen X-ray apparatus, which Greaves had imported from Germany at considerable expense. The institute served a dual purpose that seemed, at the time, admirably egalitarian. The upper floors contained private rooms for wealthy patients who paid handsomely for discreet treatment. These funds, Greaves publicly declared, subsidized the charity ward on the ground floor, where immigrant families could receive free or low-cost medical care. The basement, he explained, contained storage, the morgue, and his private laboratory where he conducted research that would benefit all mankind. The social structure of Millbridge in the 1890s was perfectly designed to hide horror. The wealthy didn't question a doctor who kept their secrets and provided them with the latest medical treatments from Europe. The poor were grateful for any medical care at all, especially from a doctor who spoke their languages and didn't demand payment up front. The middle class, the clerks, foremen, and shopkeepers, were simply proud that their town had attracted such an eminent physician. The police force, all 23 officers, were focused on labor strikes, drunken brawls, and the occasional murder in the tenements. Chief of Police Patrick O'Brien, himself an Irish immigrant made good, had his hands full managing the ethnic tensions between different immigrant groups and keeping the peace between labor organizers and mill owners. A missing immigrant here or there, that was hardly worth investigating when the person in question had no family in America and might have simply moved to Chicago or Detroit for better work. The local newspaper, the Millbridge Gazette, was owned by Samuel Morrison, whose brother-in-law, Judge Franklin Morrison, would later be revealed as one of Greaves' collaborators. The paper regularly ran glowing articles about Dr. Greaves' charitable work, his medical innovations, and his contributions to the community. When the doctor donated $5,000 to build a new wing for the Millbridge Orphanage in 1897, he was hailed as a humanitarian. When he offered free vaccinations during the smallpox scare of 1899, he was called a hero. This was the perfect ecosystem for a predator. A stratified society where the powerful needed discretion, the poor needed help, and everyone in between was too busy surviving to ask questions. A place where progress and innovation were valued above tradition, where a doctor's experiments were seen as advancing medical science rather than violating human dignity. A town growing so rapidly that no one kept accurate count of who came and went. Dr. Thomas Ellsworth Greaves was, by all accounts, the perfect physician. He attended St. Luke's Episcopal Church every Sunday, sitting in the third pew with his leather-bound hymnal, his rich baritone voice joining the congregation in praise. He married Elizabeth Thornton, daughter of a prominent steel magnate, in 1895, and their wedding was the social event of the year, with Governor Daniel Hastings himself in attendance. They had two children, Thomas Jr., born in 1896, and Margaret, born in 1898, both delivered by Greaves' colleague, Dr. Henry Westbrook, because, as Greaves humbly stated, even a surgeon shouldn't deliver his own children. His daily routine was predictable and respectable. He arrived at St. Catherine's at precisely 7 a.m., making rounds in the charity ward first, a detail that the Millbridge Gazette never tired of mentioning. He treated dock workers' crushed fingers with the same attention he gave to Mrs. Vanderpool's migraines. He remembered names, asked about children, and often waived fees for families struggling to make ends meet. Martha Kowalski, whose testimony would later prove crucial, recalled how Dr. Greaves had saved her son's life from diphtheria in 1902 and refused payment, saying only, "The boy's recovery is payment enough." But there were patterns, subtle inconsistencies that only became clear in hindsight. Greaves had a particular interest in patients with no local family connections. When the charity ward was full, he would personally select which patients would be transferred to what he called the Recovery Annex, a section of the basement that he claimed had better ventilation for tuberculosis patients. These selections seemed humanitarian at the time. He typically chose the sickest, the most destitute, those who had no one to advocate for them. His medical innovations provided perfect cover for his true activities. When screams were occasionally heard from the basement, Greaves explained that he was pioneering new surgical techniques that, while painful, would revolutionize medicine. Progress, he would say with a sad smile, often requires temporary suffering. The medical community largely supported him. Dr. James Patterson of Pittsburgh General Hospital wrote in a 1903 letter, "While Greaves' methods may seem extreme, his results speak for themselves. His survival rates for major surgery exceed the national average by 12%. The false persona extended to every aspect of his life. He established the Greaves Medical Scholarship at the University of Pittsburgh, funding the education of 2 medical students annually. He served on the Millbridge Board of Health, where he advocated for improved sanitation in immigrant neighborhoods. He published papers regularly, though investigators would later note that his published research bore little resemblance to the experiments documented in his hidden journals. There were warning signs, dismissed or explained away by a community that couldn't conceive of such evil hiding behind such beneficence. In 1897, a Hungarian immigrant named József Váradi attempted to file a complaint with the police, claiming his brother had entered St. Catherine's with a broken leg and never returned. Greaves produced documentation showing that Miklos Váradi had died of infection, a common complication, and had been buried in the pauper's field at Riverside Cemetery. When József insisted on seeing the body, he was dismissed as grief-stricken and irrational. The police report, signed by Officer Michael Sullivan, concluded, "Complainant does not speak English well and appears confused about American medical practices." Nurse Catherine Henley, who worked at St. Catherine's from 1899 to 1901, raised concerns about the unusual amount of surgical supplies Dr. Greaves ordered, far more than the documented procedures would require. She was quietly dismissed for spreading malicious gossip and found it impossible to find work in any other medical facility in Pennsylvania. She eventually moved to Ohio, where she would work as a midwife until investigators tracked her down in 1912. The most damning warning sign came in 1905 when a medical student named Frederick Barnes, visiting from Johns Hopkins, observed what he described as highly irregular postoperative procedures during his month-long residency at St. Catherine's. Barnes reported seeing patients who had been recorded as deceased being wheeled into the basement surgery. When he questioned Dr. Greaves, he was told these were anatomical specimens for teaching purposes, procured through legal channels. Barnes' concerns, documented in a letter to his supervising professor, were dismissed as the overactive imagination of an inexperienced student. Greaves' unwitting enablers formed a protective barrier around his activities. Dr. Henry Westbrook, who shared a practice with Greaves, genuinely believed his colleague was advancing medical science. Sheriff James Crawford, who received free treatment for his chronic back pain, couldn't imagine the man who had given him his life back could be capable of taking others' lives. Reverend Charles Whitmore of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, whose daughter Greaves had saved from scarlet fever, preached about the doctor as an example of Christian charity in action. Even the merchants who supplied St. Catherine's became unknowing accomplices. Frederick Hoffman, who owned Hoffman Medical Supplies, never questioned why Dr. Greaves ordered 3 times the amount of chloroform as any other hospital in western Pennsylvania. Samuel Chen, who operated a discreet funeral service for the immigrant community, didn't think it unusual that Dr. Greaves always had bodies requiring immediate burial, always with closed caskets, always with death certificates perfectly in order. The deception was so complete that when Inspector Whitman finally opened that wrong door in 1911, his first thought wasn't that he had uncovered a crime. His initial assumption was that he had stumbled upon a legitimate medical research facility, perhaps something related to the war effort or government research. It was only when he saw the first living victim, a woman whose medical records showed she had died 6 months earlier, that the horrible truth began to dawn. The unraveling of Dr. Thomas Greaves' 18-year deception began not with Inspector Harold Whitman's fateful discovery, but with 3 seemingly unconnected incidents that occurred in the months leading up to November 1911. The first incident happened on August 3, 1911. Anna Petrova, a 19-year-old Polish seamstress, escaped from St. Catherine's Medical Institute at approximately 2 a.m., wearing only a surgical gown and bearing strange scars across her abdomen. She was found by dockworker Stanley Nowak near the Allegheny River, delirious and speaking rapidly in Polish about the underground rooms and the doctor who collects people. When Nowak brought her to the police station, she had moments of lucidity where she insisted she had been in St. Catherine's for 3 months, though hospital records showed she had been discharged after a routine appendectomy just 2 days after admission in May. Officer Patrick Donnelly, one of the few police officers who spoke Polish, took her statement. According to his report, Anna claimed she had awakened during what was supposed to be her appendectomy to find Dr. Greaves performing an entirely different procedure. She described being taken to rooms that went down and down below the basement, where she saw other patients in various states of consciousness. Some, she insisted, were missing organs that had nothing to do with their admitted ailments. She spoke of a man without eyes who had come in for a broken arm, a woman whose spine had been partially exposed and modified who had arrived with pneumonia. Dr. Greaves responded to these allegations with characteristic composure. He produced Anna's medical records, showing clear evidence of postoperative psychosis, a well-documented condition. He explained that the strange scars were from the innovative surgical technique he had used to save her life when her appendix had ruptured, a technique he had recently published in the Medical Journal of Philadelphia. As for her claims about underground rooms, he invited Officer Donnelly to inspect the basement himself. The officer found exactly what one would expect: storage rooms, the morgue, and a well-equipped surgical suite for teaching purposes. Anna was transferred to the Milbridge Asylum for Mental Disorders, where she would remain until the November investigation. The second incident occurred 6 weeks later, on September 20th. Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old accountant for Morrison Steel Works, came to Dr. Benjamin Forsyth, Milbridge's second most prominent physician, with a disturbing story. Webb's brother, Charles, had been admitted to St. Catherine's on September 1st for treatment of a severe leg fracture sustained in a mill accident. The family had been told Charles died of blood poisoning on September 7th, and his body had been quickly buried due to the infectious nature of his condition. However, Marcus swore he had seen Charles through a basement window of St. Catherine's on September 18th, 11 days after his supposed death. "It was Charles, I'm certain," Webb told Dr. Forsyth. "But he looked different. His face was the same, but his expression was blank, like he didn't recognize anything, and his movements were wrong, mechanical, like a marionette." Dr. Forsyth, who harbored professional jealousy toward Greaves, saw an opportunity. He accompanied Webb to the police station, where they filed a formal complaint. This time, the investigation couldn't be dismissed easily. Webb was a respectable citizen, a Methodist, a member of the Milbridge Business Association. Chief O'Brien himself led a surprise inspection of St. Catherine's on September 22nd. They found nothing. Dr. Greaves, seemingly unsurprised by the visit, cooperated fully. He walked them through every room, opened every door, even showed them the basement surgical suite where he conducted his research. He explained that the man Webb had seen was probably Timothy Carlton, a patient recovering from facial reconstruction surgery who bore a passing resemblance to Charles Webb. Carlton was brought forward, conscious and speaking, though his face was heavily bandaged. The death certificate for Charles Webb was produced, signed by both Dr. Greaves and Nurse Margaret Sheffield. The grave at Riverside Cemetery was even opened, revealing a body that Marcus Webb tearfully identified as his brother. But Dr. Forsyth wasn't satisfied. Something about the inspection bothered him, a nagging feeling that they had been shown exactly what Greaves wanted them to see. He began his own investigation, reviewing death certificates from St. Catherine's over the past 5 years. What he found was troubling. The mortality rate at St. Catherine's was actually lower than average, but the deaths that did occur showed an unusual pattern. 23% of deaths were attributed to surgical complications, compared to a national average of 8%. More concerning, 61% of these deaths occurred in patients with no local family connections. Forsyth brought his findings to State Medical Inspector Harold Whitman in early November, suggesting that St. Catherine's was due for a routine inspection. Whitman, a methodical man who had conducted dozens of such inspections, scheduled his visit for November 17th. He arrived at 10 a.m., accompanied by his assistant, Thomas Hartley, and Nurse Inspector Dorothy Banks. The inspection proceeded normally for the first 3 hours. The charity ward was clean and well-maintained. The surgical suite met all state standards. The morgue was properly refrigerated. Patient records were meticulously kept. It was while inspecting the basement storage area that Whitman made his fateful error, or perhaps it was fate itself intervening. The basement of St. Catherine's was a maze of corridors and storage rooms. Whitman, following his standard inspection protocol, was checking each room against the building's official blueprint. He noticed a discrepancy. The blueprint showed a storage room at the end of the eastern corridor, but the wall seemed to extend another 10 feet beyond where the room should end. While measuring the walls, he noticed what appeared to be a door, painted the same industrial green as the walls with no handle visible. "Dr. Greaves," Whitman called out, "what's behind this door?" Greaves, who had been calmly answering questions all morning, showed the first sign of distress. "That's simply an old storage closet, Inspector. It's been sealed for years, structural damage from the floods of 1907. But Whitman, thorough as always, insisted on seeing it. He pressed against the wall, and the hidden door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The smell hit them first, chloroform mixed with something organic and wrong. The narrow corridor beyond the door was lit by electric bulbs that shouldn't have been there if the room had been sealed since 1907. Whitman stepped inside, his feet echoing on stone steps that descended at a steeper angle than the rest of the basement. "Inspector, please," Greaves said, his composure cracking. "You don't understand what you're—" But Whitman was already descending. The corridor opened into the first chamber, and even his years of medical inspections hadn't prepared him for what he saw. 22 large glass containers lined the walls, each filled with a clear preservative solution. Floating within were human organs, hearts, lungs, kidneys, sections of brain tissue, each labeled with a name and date. But these weren't normal anatomical specimens. Many showed signs of surgical modification. Hearts with additional chambers, lungs with artificial bronchial tubes, kidneys connected to mechanical pumps that were still functioning. Nurse Banks screamed. Hartley vomited. Whitman, forcing himself to remain clinical, noted that the newest specimen was dated November 15th, just 2 days ago. The name on the label was Charles Webb. The second chamber contained the surgical equipment, devices that defied medical explanation. There were restraint tables with attachment points for limbs that could be adjusted to inhuman angles. Surgical tools that seemed designed for procedures that no medical textbook described. Mechanical devices that appeared to be artificial organ systems, some still pumping fluids through tubes. On one wall, detailed anatomical drawings showed human bodies with impossible modifications. Extra limbs, redundant organ systems, neural pathways that connected to mechanical devices. But it was the third chamber that broke them all. 7 living patients, though patients seemed the wrong word for what they had become. They were conscious, alert, but altered in ways that challenged the definition of human. One woman's chest cavity had been replaced with a glass panel, her still-beating heart visible, connected to a mechanical pump that assisted its rhythm. A man's skull had been partially replaced with a clear material, his brain tissue visible, with copper wires inserted into specific regions. Another patient's limbs had been surgically lengthened, giving him a spider-like appearance. The worst was a young man, perhaps 25 years old, whose medical chart identified him as Michael Kowalski. The son Martha Kowalski thought Dr. Greaves had saved from diphtheria 9 years ago. Half of his body remained normal, while the other half had been systematically replaced with mechanical parts, not prosthetics, but integrated machinery that responded to his nervous system. When he saw the inspectors, he tried to speak, but the only sound that emerged was a mechanical clicking. If this is giving you chills, if you're sitting there wondering how such horrors could exist in a civilized society, then you're beginning to understand why this case was hidden for almost a century. Before we dive into the full scope of Dr. Greaves' experiments and the network that supported them, please hit that like button and share this video. The more people who know about these historical horrors, the better we can guard against them happening again. Let's discover together what happens next, because what Inspector Whitman found in those chambers was just the beginning. The documents seized from Greaves' office would reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, medical institutions that are still prestigious today, and a philosophy so disturbing that even hardened investigators couldn't read the materials without taking breaks. Are you ready for the truth? Are you prepared to learn what the Society for Human Advancement really believed they were accomplishing? Because once you know what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at a hospital the same way again. Inspector Harold Whitman's emergency telegraph to the Pennsylvania State Police Bureau at 2:47 p.m. on November 17, 1911, read simply, "Require immediate assistance sent. Catherine's Medical Institute. Multiple victims found alive. Crimes against nature discovered. Seal all exits. Send all available officers and medical personnel. Bring restraints for 1 doctor, possibly more accomplices." Within 3 hours sent. Catherine's was surrounded by 47 police officers from 3 jurisdictions. Dr. Greaves, who had attempted to destroy documents in his office furnace, was arrested along with Nurse Margaret Sheffield, Dr. Henry Westbrook, and 4 orderlies who were found attempting to relocate equipment from a 4th underground chamber that the initial inspection had missed. The physical evidence recovered over the next 72 hours would fill 16 evidence lockers and require testimony from 14 medical experts to fully catalog. The glass containers in the first chamber didn't simply hold preserved organs. They contained what Greaves' journals called evolutionary improvements. Each organ had been surgically modified while still inside living patients, then removed to observe if the modifications continued functioning independently. Subject number 12, labeled as Patricia O'Malley, March 1899, contained a heart that had been altered to have 3 additional chambers and was still beating 12 years after removal. Powered by an electrical current Greaves had somehow encoded into the tissue itself. The journals, hidden behind a false wall in Greaves' office, documented 312 separate procedures, performed between 1893 and 1911. Each entry included meticulous notes on the subject's original condition, the planned modifications, the surgical process, and the results. The clinical detachment of the writing was perhaps more horrifying than the procedures themselves. Entry number 78, dated October 12, 1901, read: Subject presented with pneumonia, female, approximately 22 years, Polish origin, no local connections verified. Procedure: bilateral lung enhancement with copper mesh integration for increased oxygen absorption. The subject survived initial surgery. Day 3, respiratory function improved 34%. Day 7, subject showing signs of copper toxicity. Day 12, administered chelation therapy. Day 18, lung tissue beginning to merge with mesh as anticipated. Day 24, subject deceased. Autopsy revealed successful tissue metal integration, but brain death from heavy metal poisoning. Note for future procedures: reduce copper content by 40%. The 7 living victims found in the third chamber were immediately transported to Pittsburgh General Hospital, though the medical team there was wholly unprepared for what they encountered. Dr. James Patterson, who had previously praised Greaves' work, later testified, "We didn't know if removing the modifications would kill them, or if leaving them would be worse. These weren't simple surgical alterations. The mechanical elements had become part of their biological systems." Margaret Hoffman, age 31, had been admitted to St. Catherine's in June 1911 for treatment of a broken wrist. The woman found in the chamber had functioning gills surgically installed along her neck, her lungs modified to process both air and water. She had been kept in a specially designed tank that could be flooded and drained. Her testimony, given through written notes as her vocal cords had been altered, revealed that she had been conscious for most of the procedures, paralyzed but aware, as Greaves explained each modification in academic detail. The most extensive modifications had been performed on Thomas Garrett, a 28-year-old former steel worker. Over the course of 6 months, Greaves had systematically replaced his digestive system with a mechanical processor that could break down any organic matter into nutrients. Garrett's medical file included notes on plans to eliminate the need for traditional food entirely, creating what Greaves called a self-sustaining human system. Garrett survived the rescue, but took his own life 6 weeks later, leaving a note that said simply, "I am no longer what God intended." The document that would prove most damaging wasn't found in the underground chambers, but in a safe deposit box at First National Bank of Millbridge, discovered when investigators found the key hidden in Greaves' home study. Inside was the charter for the Society for Human Advancement, signed by 37 individuals, including Pennsylvania Senator William Crawford, federal Judge Franklin Morrison, and Dr. Richard Blackwood, Dean of Johns Hopkins Medical School. The Society's stated purpose, written in Greaves' precise handwriting, was to guide human evolution through directed biological improvement, creating a superior race capable of withstanding the industrial age's demands. The document outlined a 20-year plan that involved establishing research centers in 12 cities, with St. Catherine's serving as the prototype. Each center would focus on different improvements: enhanced strength for laborers, increased intelligence for the professional class, and what they termed aesthetic modifications for those willing to pay premium prices. Financial records revealed that the society had accumulated over $400,000 in funding from industrial magnates who believed they were investing in the future of humanity. James Morrison of Morrison Steel had contributed $50,000 after Greaves successfully treated his son's polio, though investigators would later discover the boy had never had polio at all, and the cure had been staged to gain Morrison's support. Perhaps most disturbing were the breeding protocols found in a separate leather journal. Greaves had identified 17 women in Milbridge who possessed what he considered superior genetic material. His plans included abducting them for what he called directed reproduction experiments. 3 women on the list, Mary Fitzgerald, Dorothy Vance, and Helen Nowak, had indeed gone missing in 1910 and 1911. Their bodies were found in a 5th chamber, discovered only when investigators noticed irregularities in the basement's foundation. They had been subjected to surgical procedures designed to allow for accelerated gestation and multiple simultaneous pregnancies. None had survived more than 3 months. The investigation revealed that Greaves had been shipping preserved specimens and detailed documentation to colleagues across the country. Dr. Eugene Hardwick in Boston had received 12 packages containing tissue samples and surgical instruments. Dr. Carl Brenner in Chicago had been sent what Greaves described as successful hybridization samples, tissue that combined human and animal cells in ways that shouldn't have been possible with 1911 medical technology. Nurse Margaret Sheffield's testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealed the day-to-day operations of the horror. She described how patients were selected, always those without strong family connections, often immigrants who spoke little English, occasionally vagrants or prostitutes who wouldn't be missed. She told investigators about the drugs Greaves had developed to keep patients conscious but paralyzed during procedures, compounds that left no trace in standard toxicology tests. Sheffield also revealed the existence of what Greaves called his masterwork, a project he had been developing since 1908. In the deepest part of the underground complex, behind a locked iron door, investigators found Greaves' attempt to create what he called the perfect human. Using parts from multiple subjects, he had been constructing a composite being, attempting to combine the best physical and mental attributes of various victims. The project, mercifully, had been unsuccessful, though the laboratory contained evidence of at least 4 attempts, each more ambitious than the last. The most chilling discovery came from Greaves' personal correspondence with a Dr. Friedrich Kastner in Berlin. The letters, written in German, discussed shared research and techniques. Kastner wrote of similar experiments being conducted in Prague, Vienna, and Munich. He mentioned a conference planned for 1912 where practitioners of advanced biological modification would share their findings. The guest list included doctors from 9 countries, suggesting that the Society for Human Advancement was merely the American branch of a much larger organization. When confronted with the evidence, Greaves showed no remorse. In his initial interrogation, conducted by District Attorney Robert Hayes, he insisted that his work would have been celebrated in 50 years. "Every great leap forward in human knowledge requires sacrifice," he said. "The subjects gave their lives for the advancement of the species. In time, when humans have conquered disease, aging, and physical limitation, I will be remembered as a pioneer, not a criminal." The true number of victims may never be known. Investigators identified 127 suspicious deaths at St. Catherine's between 1893 and 1911, but Greaves' journals reference subject numbers up to 312. The discrepancy suggests that many bodies were disposed of through methods that left no trace. A search of the abandoned Brennan mine, located 6 miles from Milbridge, revealed bone fragments from at least 40 individuals, though complete identification was impossible. The arrest of Dr. Thomas Greaves should have been the end of the horror, but for lead investigator Harold Whitman and District Attorney Robert Hayes, It was only the beginning of a labyrinthine conspiracy that would consume the next 2 years of their lives, and in Whitman's case, ultimately cost him his sanity. The first indication of the broader network came on November 20th, 1911, just 3 days after Greaves' arrest. Judge Franklin Morrison, whose name appeared on the Society for Human Advancement Charter, issued an injunction halting the investigation, citing lack of proper warrants and violation of medical privacy laws. The injunction was overturned within 6 hours by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, but during that time, 3 warehouses in Pittsburgh burned to the ground. Fire investigators would later determine arson, though no arrests were ever made. Witnesses reported seeing well-dressed men removing crates from the buildings just hours before the fires started. District Attorney Hayes received his first death threat on November 22nd. A letter, delivered to his home, contained a photograph of his daughter Alice leaving school, with a simple message: "Some investigations are hazardous to one's family health." Hayes moved his family to relatives in Ohio and hired private security, but the threats continued. His office was burglarized twice in December, though nothing appeared to be taken. A message, Hayes understood, that they could reach him anywhere. Inspector Whitman's investigation team faced systematic obstruction. When they attempted to interview Dr. Richard Blackwood at Johns Hopkins, they were informed he had taken an unexpected sabbatical to Europe. His personal files had been accidentally destroyed in a chemical fire that damaged only his office. Similarly, when investigators arrived at the Chicago practice of Dr. Carl Brenner, they found the building abandoned, with neighbors reporting that moving trucks had emptied the office in the middle of the night, just 12 hours before the investigators' arrival. But the investigation pressed on, and what they uncovered suggested a network far more extensive than initially imagined. On December 3, 1911, acting on information from Nurse Sheffield, investigators raided a farmhouse outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. What they found there made St. Catherine's look like a preliminary experiment. The farmhouse concealed an underground facility 3 times the size of Greaves' chambers, with equipment suggesting operations dating back to 1887, 6 years before Greaves had even arrived in America. The Harrisburg facility was operated by Dr. Vincent Ashford, a 63-year-old physician who had supposedly died in 1909. Ashford had faked his death and continued his work in secret, funded by a consortium of wealthy industrialists who believed they were investing in life extension research. The facility contained detailed records of experiments on at least 200 subjects, including children as young as 7 years old. Ashford had been attempting to arrest the aging process through what he called cellular reconstitution, a process that involved replacing aged tissue with younger cells harvested from unwilling donors. Ashford's capture led to more revelations. Under interrogation, and facing evidence that could send him to the electric chair, he revealed the existence of the American Eugenics Council, a shadow organization that had been operating since 1882. The council, according to Ashford, had been inspired by the work of Sir Francis Galton in England, but had taken his theories of selective breeding to extremes Galton himself would have found abhorrent. The council's membership list, which Ashford provided in exchange for a life sentence rather than execution, read like a who's who of American industrial and political power. It included 3 senators, 2 governors, 11 judges, and the owners of some of America's largest corporations. Their goal wasn't simply to improve the human race through selective breeding, but to create what they called directed evolution, using surgical and chemical means to accelerate human change. On December 15th, investigators made another breakthrough. A telegram from Dr. Eugene Hardwick in Boston, intercepted by federal agents, mentioned the Philadelphia materials must be relocated before the winter conference. This led investigators to a warehouse in Philadelphia's Dock District, where they discovered what could only be described as a distribution center for human experimentation. The warehouse contained preserved specimens from dozens of facilities across the country, detailed surgical manuals, for procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics, and correspondence revealing active experimentation sites in Boston, Baltimore, Detroit, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Each site had a different focus. Boston concentrated on neural enhancement, Baltimore on muscular modification, Detroit on industrial adaptations to allow workers to better withstand factory conditions. The San Francisco facility, investigators learned, had been destroyed in the 1906 earthquake, but not before completing what internal documents called Project Antipode, an attempt to create humans capable of surviving extreme conditions. The subjects had been modified to withstand temperatures ranging from -40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Of the 37 subjects, none survived more than a year, but the research had been sent to facilities in Alaska and Death Valley for field testing. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the New Orleans site. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, operating under the cover of a charity hospital, had been conducting experiments in what he called consciousness transfer, attempting to move human consciousness from one body to another. His notes, recovered from a hidden vault, described 17 attempts, all failures, but with what he considered promising neural activity patterns in the recipient bodies for up to 4 hours after the procedure. The investigation also uncovered international connections that suggested the American operations were part of a global network. Letters from Dr. Friedrich Kastner in Berlin discussed similar work being conducted across Europe. A Dr. Dmitry Volkov in St. Petersburg wrote of experiments with extreme human endurance using political prisoners in Siberia. Dr. Adelaide Blackstone in London mentioned her work with mental enhancement through surgical intervention, funded by members of the British aristocracy who wanted to ensure their children's intellectual superiority. As the investigation widened, resistance from powerful interests intensified. Senator William Crawford attempted to have the investigation shut down through federal legislation, arguing it was damaging American medical research and international reputation. When that failed, he tried to have Hayes removed from office on trumped-up corruption charges. The charges were dismissed, but the message was clear. The council had reached into the highest levels of government. On January 8, 1912, Inspector Whitman's home was burned to the ground. He and his family escaped, but all his personal copies of investigation documents were destroyed. The official copies, stored in the Millbridge police station, were found to be contaminated with a chemical that made them illegible within hours of discovery. Only the copies Hayes had secretly made and stored in multiple locations preserved the evidence. The investigation revealed that the Society for Human Advancement and the American Eugenics Council had been documenting their work with the intention of publication, but not for decades. They believed that by 1950, their ideas would be mainstream, their methods accepted as necessary for human survival in an industrial world. They had been creating a comprehensive archive of their experiments, successes and failures alike, stored in a location they referred to only as the repository. Despite months of searching, the repository was never found. Intercepted communications suggested it contained not just documents, but preserved specimens, surgical equipment, and detailed instructions for recreating every experiment conducted over 30 years. Its location was known only to the innermost circle of the council, most of whom had fled the country by February 1912. The international scope of the conspiracy became clear when investigators learned of the Berlin Conference, scheduled for May 1912. This gathering of what internal documents called progressive biological researchers was to be the first international symposium on human modification. The conference was canceled after Greaves' arrest, but intelligence reports suggested similar meetings had been held annually since 1895 in various European cities, always in secret, always attended by respected members of the medical establishment. One of the most chilling discoveries was a letter from Greaves to Kastner, dated just 1 week before his arrest, discussing Phase 2 of their plan. This phase involved moving from individual modifications to what Greaves called population-level interventions, introducing chemicals into water supplies that would make populations more susceptible to modification, creating diseases that only modified humans could survive, and establishing breeding programs that would be disguised as public health initiatives. By March 1912, investigators had identified at least 400 individuals involved in the conspiracy at various levels, from the doctors performing experiments to the businessmen providing funding to the politicians providing legal protection. Yet arrests were made on fewer than 30 individuals. Many conspirators had fled to countries without extradition treaties. Others had connections powerful enough to avoid prosecution. Still others simply disappeared, their fates unknown. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, when we thought the depths of this horror couldn't go any deeper, the investigation revealed that this wasn't just about a few rogue doctors. This was a coordinated effort to fundamentally alter humanity itself, and some of those involved are names you'd recognize, families whose descendants still hold power today. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you question how well we really know our history, then please, share this before it's too late. Share it with everyone who needs to know that the trusted institutions of the past harbored unspeakable darkness. We're not just a channel here. We're a true crime family, united in uncovering the truths that others want to keep buried. The legal proceedings that followed would shake Pennsylvania to its core, but as you're about to learn, justice in 1912 looked very different than what we might expect today. And some of those who escaped would continue their work in shadows, we're only now beginning to illuminate. The trial of Dr. Thomas Ellsworth Greaves began on March 4, 1912, in the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh. The decision to move the trial from Millbridge was made after it became clear that finding an impartial jury in the town where Greaves had practiced for 18 years would be impossible. Half the population had been his patients. The other half had family members who had disappeared under his care. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Hayes with assistance from Special Prosecutor William Thornton from Philadelphia, faced immediate challenges. 3 key witnesses died under mysterious circumstances before they could testify. Dr. Vincent Ashford was found dead in his cell, officially ruled a suicide, though the guards on duty that night were notably absent from their posts. Martha Kowalski, whose son had been among the victims, died of apparent heart failure despite being in good health. Frederick Barnes, the medical student who had raised early concerns, drowned in a boating accident on a clear day in calm waters. The defense team, led by Hamilton Worthington III, one of Pennsylvania's most prestigious lawyers, employed a strategy that would seem unconscionable today, but was remarkably effective in 1912. They didn't deny the experiments had taken place. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, they argued that Greaves was insane, driven mad by his pursuit of medical advancement. They brought in 3 psychiatric experts who testified that Greaves suffered from moral insanity, a condition that impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong while leaving his intellectual faculties intact. More insidiously, Worthington argued that many of the victims were voluntary participants who had agreed to experimental treatments in exchange for free medical care. He produced documents, later proven to be forged but accepted by the court, showing consent forms signed with X's, supposedly by illiterate immigrants who had agreed to advanced medical procedures. The jury, composed of 12 white Protestant men, 6 of whom were business owners who had social connections to some of the accused conspirators, deliberated for 4 days. On March 22, 1912, they returned a verdict that shocked the nation but surprised no one who understood the power dynamics at play. Greaves was found guilty of unlawful medical practice resulting in death rather than murder, guilty of improper disposal of human remains, rather than the desecration of corpses, and guilty of medical fraud for falsifying death certificates. The judge, Harold Blackman, whose own connections to the American Eugenics Council wouldn't be discovered until 1978, sentenced Greaves to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The courtroom erupted. Families of victims wailed. Anna Petrova, who had been brought from the asylum to testify, collapsed and had to be carried out. The Millbridge Gazette called it justice served, while the New York Times ran an editorial questioning whether justice was possible when the system itself was compromised. Of the other 29 individuals arrested in connection with the case, only 11 were convicted. Nurse Margaret Sheffield received 10 years, serving only 4 before being quietly released. Dr. Henry Westbrook was acquitted after his lawyer successfully argued he had been deceived by Greaves. The 4 orderlies were convicted of conspiracy and received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Senator William Crawford was never charged, despite clear evidence of his involvement. He retired from the Senate in 1913, citing health concerns, and lived comfortably on his estate until his death in 1927. Judge Franklin Morrison resigned from the bench but faced no criminal charges. He moved to Argentina in 1913, where he reportedly continued practicing law until his death in 1934. Dr. Richard Blackwood of Johns Hopkins returned from his European sabbatical in 1914 and resumed his position as dean. The university conducted an internal investigation that concluded there was insufficient evidence of his involvement in any crimes. He retired with full honors in 1925, his portrait still hanging in the medical school until protests finally had it removed in 2009. The 7 living victims found in Greaves' chambers faced futures that offered little hope. Margaret Hoffman, the woman with surgically installed gills, survived 3 years in a specialized medical facility before dying of organ failure. The modifications had fundamentally altered her body chemistry in ways that medical science of the era couldn't address. Michael Kowalski, the young man with mechanically integrated parts, lived until 1924 in a state institution, never regaining the ability to speak normally. He communicated through written notes until the end, repeatedly writing, "Make me whole again." Only 2 of the 7 survived past 1930. Elizabeth Hartley, whose modifications were the least extensive, primarily involving enhanced sensory organs, lived until 1943, spending her final years in a convent where the nuns cared for her despite her appearance. She never spoke of her experience except once, telling a young nun, "Hell isn't fire and brimstone. Hell is a doctor's table where God's design is undone." The case led to some reforms, though far fewer than might be expected. The Pennsylvania Medical Board instituted new inspection procedures, though these were widely seen as cosmetic changes that wouldn't prevent determined individuals from conducting illegal experiments. The Federal Medical Practice Act of 1913 established minimum standards for medical facilities, but enforcement was sporadic and often corrupted by the same interests that had protected Greaves. The most significant change was the creation of the Medical Ethics Review Board, established in 1914, which required all experimental procedures to be registered and reviewed. However, the board's first chairman was Dr. Eugene Hardwick of Boston, one of the suspected but never prosecuted conspirators. Under his leadership, the board became less a guardian against abuse and more a network for like-minded researchers to share information discreetly. The international response was even more muted. The Berlin Conference may have been canceled, but intelligence reports from 1913 indicated that smaller, more secretive meetings continued throughout Europe. The onset of World War I provided both cover and opportunity for continued experimentation, with military medical units offering perfect conditions for unethical research disguised as battlefield medicine. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the aftermath was the number of conspirators who simply vanished. By April 1912, at least 60 individuals identified as part of the network had disappeared. Some fled to South America, where witnesses reported seeing American doctors establishing new practices in remote areas. Others went to Eastern Europe, where the political chaos provided cover for their activities. Dr. Karl Brenner was spotted in Russia in 1915, reportedly working with the Tsarist government on soldier enhancement programs. The repository, the legendary archive of 30 years of illegal human experimentation, was never found despite extensive searching. In 1913, a former orderly at St. Catherine's claimed to know its location and offered to reveal it for immunity and $10,000. He was found dead the next day, his death ruled accidental despite clear signs of strangulation. Three other individuals who claimed knowledge of the repository met similar fates, and eventually, investigators stopped looking, whether from fear or because they were told to by higher authorities. Greaves himself remained unrepentant to the end. From his cell in Western State Penitentiary, he continued to write, producing over 2,000 pages of notes on human modification that prison guards were supposed to confiscate but somehow always missed. These writings were smuggled out and circulated among sympathetic researchers. In 1924, he published a book through a Swiss publisher, The Future of Human Evolution, which was immediately banned in the United States but remained available in Europe until 1946. On November 17, 1925, exactly 14 years after his arrest, Greaves was found dead in his cell. The official cause was listed as heart failure, though the prison doctor noted in his private journal that Greaves' heart showed signs of the same modifications found in his victims, modifications that couldn't have been performed on himself. The implication was clear. Someone had continued his work and had given him a taste of his own medicine, though whether as punishment or reward remains unknown. The surviving families of victims received no compensation. A civil suit filed against Greaves' estate was dismissed when it was discovered he had transferred all his assets to a trust in Switzerland years before his arrest. Attempts to sue St. Catherine's Medical Institute failed when the corporation that owned it declared bankruptcy, its assets mysteriously vanishing into a web of shell companies that investigators couldn't untangle. The building itself stood empty until 1917, when it was purchased by an anonymous buyer who had it demolished. Workers on the demolition crew reported finding additional chambers that hadn't been discovered in the original investigation, including one that contained what appeared to be children's surgical tables, though this was never officially confirmed. The lot remained empty until 1943 when it was paved over for a parking garage, burying whatever secrets remained under tons of concrete. The case of Dr. Thomas Greaves and the Society for Human Advancement reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of progress and the human capacity for evil dressed in the clothing of advancement. It demonstrates how easily a society can be made complicit in horror when that horror is gradual, methodical, and performed by those we trust most implicitly. What happened in Milbridge wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of ideas that were disturbingly mainstream in early 20th century America. The eugenics movement, which wouldn't be fully discredited until after World War II, had adherents in the highest levels of society. Presidents, Supreme Court justices, and titans of industry openly discussed the need to improve the human race through selective breeding and the elimination of undesirable traits. Greaves and his collaborators simply took these ideas to their mechanical, surgical conclusion. The horror lies not in how different Greaves was from his contemporaries, but in how similar. His published papers, the legitimate ones, were cited approvingly in medical journals for decades. His techniques for antiseptic surgery saved countless lives. His advocacy for public health measures helped reduce infant mortality in Milbridge by 30%. Evil and good coexisted in the same hands, performed by the same mind, justified by the same philosophy of the greater good. Perhaps most disturbing is how the system protected itself. Of the estimated 400 individuals involved in the conspiracy, fewer than 30 were arrested, 11 convicted, and only Greaves died in prison. The rest melted back into society, carrying their knowledge and their beliefs with them. How many continued their work in subtler ways? How many passed their philosophies to students who never knew the source? How many of their descendants carry on similar work today, clothed in different language but driven by the same fundamental belief that some humans have the right to determine the biological future of others. The story was hidden for 97 years not because it was too horrible to tell, but because too many powerful people had too much to lose from its telling. The families of senators and judges, the institutions that still train our doctors, the corporations built on fortunes made from investing in human experimentation, all had an interest in keeping this history buried. When the records were finally released in 2008, 16 pages remained classified. In 2019, a Freedom of Information Act request for those pages was denied on grounds of ongoing national security concerns. What could possibly be in those pages that remains dangerous a century later? We tell ourselves that we've learned from history that the medical ethics violations of the past could never happen today. We have review boards, informed consent, international treaties. But Greaves had operated under the supervision of a medical board too. His patients had signed consent forms, even if forged. The international medical community of 1911 had standards and ethics. They simply didn't apply to everyone equally. The true lesson of the Greaves case isn't about the monster who performed experiments in a basement in Pennsylvania. It's about the hundreds of people who knew something was wrong and said nothing. It's about the authorities who could have investigated but chose not to. It's about the patients who disappeared and were forgotten because they were poor, foreign, different. It's about how easily we surrender our skepticism to those who wear white coats and speak with authority. In the end, Harold Whitman, the inspector who discovered the horror, never recovered from what he saw. He retired in 1913, suffering from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. In his final years, spent in a sanitarium, he would repeat the same phrase. The door was always there, we just chose not to open it. So I ask you now, after hearing this story that was buried for nearly a century, what do you think really happened to the repository? That archive of 30 years of human experimentation, containing knowledge that powerful people killed to protect. Do you believe it was truly destroyed? Or is it sitting in some government facility, some private collection, some pharmaceutical company's deepest vault? And those 16 pages that remain classified to this day? What horror could they contain that our government still considers too dangerous to release 111 years later? What names might be on those pages that would shake the foundations of institutions we still trust today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think really happened? Are there connections we missed? Some of you have ancestors from Milbridge, from Pittsburgh, from that era. What stories did your families whisper about the doctor who disappeared people? If you made it through this entire dark journey with me, you're braver than most. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell because next week, we're investigating the 1923 case of the Salvation Army building in Cincinnati, where 17 children entered a charity Christmas pageant, and only 11 came out. A case the FBI reopened in 2019 for reasons they won't disclose. Thank you for your courage in listening to this story. Thank you for believing that the truth, no matter how dark, deserves to be told. Until next time, keep your eyes open and question everything, especially those we trust the most. Remember, the door is always there. The question is whether we're brave enough to open it.